Welcome to Black Jackal Gaming. We're going to take a look at terrain in Warhammer 40,000. We're going to take a look at how much of the terrain you actually need on your tabletop, what type of terrain is required, how objectives should be placed and how it affects your terrain placement, what's fair for all types of armies, and how to set up a board. So taking a look at how much terrain do you need. 40k tabletop games, they're very terrain heavy. They're designed to have a lot of terrain on the tabletop to minimize armies having the ability just to wipe out an army in turns 1 and 2. You should be expected to cover at least a quarter of the table, and this will be used in all different types of terrain. You're more looking towards 50% of the tabletop being covered in terrain just to block out a lot of line of sight and allow your armies to last as long as possible on the tabletop. You need to make sure you have enough terrain that's going to obstruct movement for large models. Large models are generally more powerful than the smaller models, so they really do have to be restrictive in how they operate on the tabletop. So you need plenty of terrain to minimize their impact, as well as block line of sight for your alpha shooting armies. Now, how you want to set up, especially for like a tabletop casual game, is imagine a top-down view of a major city where you've got your roads, your buildings, and then you've got a lot of scattered terrain, which would be like trees and cars, trucks, buses, things like that. Large signage outside of shops, just enough around the buildings to give it a little bit of flavour and a little bit of character. But what type of terrain do you need? Well, there's quite a few different types of terrain you can have in 40k, but the main type of terrain that 10th edition has been built around are ruins. Now, they offer the ability for infantry to move through the walls as if they don't exist. The idea behind this is that there will be doors and windows which they climb through or walk through, and this prevents monsters and vehicles doing the same. So monsters and vehicles will have to go around ruins, whilst your infantry can just move in. It also allows units to hide behind it. This will be blocking line of sight so they can't get shot, and it allows them to set up melee attacks and charges later on in the game, which is quite nice. You'll also be having a fair amount of solid line of sight blocking terrain. This is a bit different from your ruins as you can't move through it, but these will be things such as cargo boxes, large factory equipment, things along those lines. And these are really useful for shooting armies. Although they do block line of sight, they do make it harder for your melee armies to stage behind because they cannot just walk through it like they can with ruins. They will have to move around it still. These are generally smaller than a lot of the ruins, but they do help to minimize shooting lanes, so you can't just set up somewhere on the battlefield and see the entire battlefield and destroy whatever comes into your path. So both of the above, they do grant your benefits of cover, which gives you the +1 to the save for the unit. This is only activated if you have a save that is worse than 3+, so if you've got a 4+ or 5+ save and 0 AP attack, it will activate. For your 3+ and better saves, it will have to have AP before it activates. There are some other terrain such as low walls, craters. They're not quite as useful as the other bits of terrain because they only really give you benefits if you're wholly within or next to them, and they do take up quite a large footprint for not really offering as much. You do have the likes of wooded area as well, which is essentially very similar to ruins, but you are mainly going to be leaning into ruins and your line of sight blocking terrain. Now, there is some scatter terrain that you can use, such as your barrels and your general boxes, which they can make your board look a little bit prettier, a little bit more thematic for the armies you're going to be using, and just make it more of an enjoyable game. You will get benefits of cover when your units are hiding behind them as well, which is quite nice, but they do make the tabletop feel a little bit more authentic. So what do you do with the objectives? So you want to keep them safe, keep them hidden really. You don't want them to be in a position where one objective can be seen by 2, 3, 4 of the other objectives, because this will allow armies just to set up a durable, hard-hitting unit on one objective and basically tie down the other objectives by stopping the opposition from controlling them. You want to really minimize the firing lines in between them, and this just allows you to have a greater control over the board and have a more enjoyable experience. You do want to be fighting over objectives by actually having to move your armies, move into positions, take up firing zones, put your army in a position where it can stage to carry off charges, rather than everyone just sitting stationary and trying to shoot each other off of the objectives. A partial line of sight on objectives is fine, because this will limit the amount of firepower that can go onto it, and it will also put your opponent in a position where if they want to be on the edge of one objective to try and see the edge of another, they are going to put themselves in a vulnerable position where they might be easy to shoot off, they might have less access to terrain, or when they're placing these models to shoot and they get return fire, these are the models they don't really want to be losing, so they want to keep them a little bit safer themselves. Unlike some other editions, objectives can go in terrain, so you can hide them within. These are quite good because it allows you to keep your units a little bit safer. You'll be getting the benefits of cover, and it just makes it harder to push people off of objectives. You really want to be considering how you approach these objectives and add a little bit more of a tactical play to the game rather than just standing still and shooting people off of objectives. Now, you will have some objectives that will be out in the open based on how the train's set up or what the mission rule is, but you don't want to have them all out in the open because it doesn't really make much sense for a priority objective to be in the middle of the street, out in the middle of the square. A lot of these objectives, they should really be in areas a little bit harder to get to. So 1 or 2 out in the open is fine, but you do really want to be considering them to have as much cover around them as possible. You also want to consider what's fair for both armies. You want a nice balance of ruins, and you want a lot of line of sight blocking, so you just prevent these firing lanes. You want a fair bit of cover in your deployment zone. You want to be able to hide as much of your army as you can in turn 1. This prevents a lot of the alpha strikes going off, so you don't want to lose 50% of your army before you've even done anything. With this as well, you do want to make sure there's a bit of line of sight blocking terrain in no man's land just to stop units having a line of sight across the entire board. You do need to bear in mind when you're setting up your terrain, your access points for your vehicles. You don't really want to be trapping them in deployment zones. Ruins are going to restrict their ability to move as well as other terrain, but you want to make sure that there are gaps in the terrain where they can move through, they can get onto objectives, and they can move across the tabletop. You don't want them just to be stuck in one stationary spot for the entire game. You do want to consider your balance of your different types of terrain. If you hide too many objectives around ruins, then your melee armies can very easily stage behind them, not be shot, and then charge through afterwards. It's also going to turn off the likes of Overwatch, because you can only overwatch a unit that you can see as it moves. If it's hiding behind a ruin and then moves through it, you won't actually be able to overwatch that unit. So if you do have some objectives within ruins, when you are holding them, you'll be within the ruins you can shoot out, so it makes it harder for melee units to just stage outside. So they've got to consider the different angles that they're coming in from. So you want to consider your lines of fire, so you're not having firing lanes everywhere, as well as not too many staging points for melee armies. But you do have to consider that you do have to have enough terrain, because you don't want to leave melee units without the option, apart from being out in the open before they charge. It's going to make them a little bit too vulnerable. So you want a healthy balance of positions where they can stage from, as well as positions where your firing armies can actually get off shots and not just be overrun. So how do you set up a board? Games Workshop has supplied quite a few terrain setups. These are quite handy. You'll find them in the rulebook. They've got some on the website, and they come in the mission packs such as Prior Nexus. There's also WTC and ITC that on their websites they have map packs that are actually very good. They show you exactly where to set up. So current terrain leans very heavily into L-shaped ruin bases. These are used a lot of the time with plasticard underneath, so you've got an area that it covers, as you can see with the red and the blue. That entire area is the ruin, but there is only partial ruins on top. This leaves quite a bit of space so vehicles can enter from one side or another, but stops them from entering from all sides. It's important to note that vehicle can only shoot through a ruin if it's fully within it. So you've often got to consider whether these terrain pieces are going to be suitable for the match ahead. The positive things about these types of area bases is that you can easily set them up with smaller ruins or walls, so it doesn't mean you have to buy as much terrain pieces and paint and store them, because terrain, especially large terrain, can be very bulky. So if you are just using these plasticard bases and then you're putting a bit of scattered terrain on, some low walls and that, you can make do with that. Always when you look at your terrain, if you think you have enough, you probably can get some more on there. Especially when you're a new player, when you set up your terrain, often you think you've set up adequately, both players agree on it, and turn 1 happens and you see big glaring errors in your placement where there's huge firing lanes, where someone has access to all objectives from one spot, or there's just big open spaces, or some of the objectives are a little bit too hard to get to and too easy to hold down. When you do come to roll for your mission and the deployment, don't be afraid to give your terrain a little rejig if it's not quite set up in the way that you want it to be set up. If it's a bit weak in one area, if the deployment zones have switched a little bit, say you've got an angled deployment zone and they look a little bit light, feel free to go and rejig your setup. It's also quite handy if you decide just to mirror deployments, so then everyone's equal on both sides. If you have any terrain pieces that seem a little bit ambiguous, where you're not sure of the line of sight blocking, whether the windows are open and you can shoot through in a ruin, or whether it is a ruin at all or a wall, discuss this at the start of the game. It's always important to agree on what terrain does what at the start of the game, because armies are going to set up and they move and make decisions based on what they think this terrain does. And if you get to say turn 2 or 3 and they go to pull a maneuver and it turns out you consider the terrain to be different, then one of you is going to have a little bit of a feel bad moment because you both set up in a way that considers this terrain to be different than it is. So at the start of the game, make sure you agree on what all the terrain is and what it does. If you like the video, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel to see future content. Take it easy. I'll see you next time.